World leaders blame Vladimir Putin for the death of his most outspoken critic. Will the unexplained passing in prison of Alexey Navalny change anything in Russia? Or will the voices of dissent become too afraid to challenge the power of the Kremlin? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Adrian Finnegan. He was respected worldwide and Vladimir Putin's most vocal critic, despite being locked up for years in a prison cell. That voice of dissent was silenced as Russia announced the death of Alexey Navalny. The country's highest profile opposition leader was 47. World leaders have been quick to blame Putin for getting rid of yet another Russian who dared to challenge him. The Kremlin is describing that reaction as unacceptable and rabid. Russians will get to choose whether Putin is re-elected for a fifth term next month. The vote already widely viewed as a foregone conclusion, given the lack of opposition voices allowed to oppose his long rule. So who might ever replace him? What does the lack of free speech mean for future opposition voices in Russia? And how will Russians remember Alexey Navalny? Laura Khan begins our coverage.
This is the last time Alexey Navalny was seen alive in public via video link from his prison cell in the Russian Arctic. Russian President Vladimir Putin's most vocal critic looked gaunt but upbeat after spending 3 years of a 19-year sentence on what he said were politically motivated charges. He predicted that his dissent would lead to his demise.
You're not allowed to give up. If they kill me, it means that we are incredibly strong.
The charismatic anti-corruption campaigner rose to prominence during protests against Putin in 2011. In 2013, Navalny ran for mayor of Moscow and planned a presidential campaign in 2016. That ended when he was convicted of fraud. In 2020, he fell ill on a flight and was evacuated to Germany, where he spent 2 weeks in a coma. Lab tests said he'd been poisoned by the nerve agent Novichok, developed by Russia's military. The Kremlin denied responsibility. He recovered and flew home in early 2021 to be immediately arrested for violating his parole.
Navalny was 100% pro-American, pro-British politician. I knew Alexey Navalny personally. He was very bright, smart, with a lot of sense of humor. And personally, I'm quite pity that he dead, and I pity about his family. My condolence to the members of his family. But now he is already not political figure at all.
Navalny's death was announced as world leaders met at the Munich Security Conference in Germany. Russia wasn't invited, but his wife Yulia was and gave a composed response.
I
want to call on the international community, all the people in this room, all over the world, to unite together and defeat this evil, defeat the horrific regime that is now in Russia.
World leaders were quick to blame Putin.
Russian authorities are going to tell their own story. But make no mistake, Putin is responsible for Navalny's death. Putin is responsible.
Navalny's death follows the killing of other Putin critics. Alexander Litvinenko accused Putin of planning a Moscow apartment bombing as an excuse to start the Chechen war in 1999. The former Russian spy was killed in London in 2006 after drinking radioactive tea. Putin denied any link. Another of his critics, former Prime Minister Boris Nemtsov, who had joined opposition protests, was shot dead in Moscow in 2015. And former Putin ally Yevgeny Prigozhin criticized the army's strategy in the war in Ukraine. He was killed in a plane crash last August, weeks after leading what Putin called an armed mutiny in southern Russia. Putin is running for re-election next month. A change in rules means that the 71-year-old could stay in power until 2036. With Navalny's death, questions will be raised over whether Putin will ever be challenged. Although it's not clear how Navalny died at the age of 47, there's little doubt that other opposition figures will fear a similar fate. Laura Khan for Inside Story, Al Jazeera.
All right, let's bring in our guests. From Moscow, we're joined by Vladimir Sotnikov, who's an associate professor of international relations at the Higher School of Economics University. From London, we're joined by Samuel Ramani, an associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. That's a defense and security think tank. And joining us from Serbia's capital, Belgrade, is Peter Nikitin, a Russian pro-democracy activist and lawyer. A warm welcome to you all, gentlemen. Peter, let's start with you. Your thoughts on the death of Alexey Navalny and what it means for Russia's pro-democracy movement. Where does it go from here?
This is a great tragedy for Russia as a country and for millions of people who knew and loved and supported Alexey Navalny. We had a spontaneous rally here in Belgrade yesterday, where people came with flowers, lit candles, and hugged and wept, and it was really as though we lost a dear person. Where does it go from here? It depends on whether we, as pro-democracy Russians, both activists and usual people, ordinary people, are going to follow what Alexei said to us when he was asked what we should do if he gets killed. He said, don't give up. If this happens, this means that they're weak, and we have to just work harder and protest louder. If we do that, Navalny will win even from his grave. If we don't, he will have given his life in vain.
Samuel Ramani, your thoughts on the death of Alexey Navalny and what it means for the future of democracy in Russia?
Well, I mean, it's obviously one of the final blows to whatever's left of democracy inside Russia, because Navalny's death did not occur in a vacuum. Even before the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine began in February 2022, civil society organizations were facing severe crackdowns. Human rights groups like Memorial were shut down. And since the invasion, we've seen Vladimir Kara-Murza meet a similar fate, returning to Russia, having 25 years in prison. Ilya Yashin also being cracked down upon, and other dissidents. So this is a major blow to democracy inside Russia. It also represents Vladimir Putin's broader strategy of cracking down on the two faces of nationalist opposition: the liberal nationalist anti-corruption campaign of Navalny, and also the ultra-nationalist vision of Evgeny Prigozhin. And now I think that Putin is relatively unchallenged heading into these elections.
Samuel, is Russia now a totalitarian state, a mafia state?
Well, I think it's certainly been a mafia state for quite a long time. I mean, you've seen the assassinations of people like Alexander Litvinenko in 2006, the Skripal poisoning, Boris Nemtsov. This is a state that clearly does not have much respect for the rule of law when it comes to how Putin and some of his surrogates, like Chechnya's leader Ramzan Kadyrov, operate. But now I think it's not just a mafia state, it's also a totalitarian one. And I think that after the elections, we will see moves like the conscription of 400,000 new soldiers into the Russian military occur, most likely without protest and without backlash, and a further movement towards a war economy.
OK, let's bring in Vladimir. Russia is now not just a mafia state, but a totalitarian state. What do you make of that? And what's your take on the death of Alexey Navalny?
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me on your show. First of all, let me disagree with the previous speaker, with Samuel, because I think Russia is not a totalitarian state. If you just compare the history, this is not like Stalinist era. We have democracy, we have democratic institutions here in Russia. Secondly, what my personal the death of Navalny. I must say that I met him briefly exactly 4 years ago when he was giving an interview, a full-fledged interview, first interview to the Western TV company, to CNN. I wasn't so much, frankly speaking, I wasn't so much impressed about what he was saying, but I saw in his office, because the interview took place in his office of the FBK, this is fund for fighting corruption. I saw a lot of young people who were very much enthusiastic. And I thought to myself, that, okay, probably this guy is a professional politician, and at least he has a goal to what he's striving. So if just shortly talking about his death, I think, and I can agree with the other speakers, that this is really a tragedy for political thought in Russia. This is a tragedy, personal tragedy for his family, for his children, and probably for the future, which is still unclear.
Okay, we'll throw this back to Samuel in just a moment. But Vladimir, was Alexei Navalny viewed differently, do you think, there in Russia to the way that he was viewed in the West?
Yes. I think that actually what I heard in his interview, he was proposing a sort of a program, which really I couldn't understand at all very well, because there were some slogans, as I think, and at the same time he was suggesting some specific actions. But let me say one thing. I think that Russian society, especially the ordinary people, they are not get used still to any drastic changes. The whole public right now, when he died, is thinking about how to pursue his own well-being, than just to see that they took part in any drastic actions like dissent. Any dissent in Russia. And at the same time, I must say that, to my mind, as a historian, any attempt of dissent in Russian history was never very much successful. If we take decabrists and then go to Solzhenitsyn and other people who were in the Soviet Union. So in this sense, I think that I was saying that the future is unclear, because I don't know who actually will be doing what in the future, because the so-called pro-democracy groups, they call themselves pro-democracy or anyway, but this is a long story to suggest something tangible for Russian society.
Samuel, do you want to come back on that? Was Navalny and what he represented someone who truly bothered President Putin to the extent that he would want him dead? Secretary of State Antony Blinken said that Putin had a fixation and fear of one man who underscored the weakness and rot at the heart of the system that Putin has created. Is he right? What danger did Navalny pose to Putin?
Well, Navalny definitely was one of the most tenacious and one of the most dedicated activists in terms of exposing the corruption that surrounded Vladimir Putin's system, as well as some of the excesses of it. I mean, he was certainly important in inspiring the demonstrations against electoral fraud in 2012 in Bolotnaya Square, which are some of the last major demonstrations. He also was helpful in inspiring demonstrations against Putin's domestic agenda not being implemented in full, and exposing the corruption of senior officials like Dmitry Medvedev, which may have even contributed to his reassignment from the prime minister position into the National Security Council. So he certainly was somebody who had the ability to mobilize people, rattle Putin, and even at times induce concessions. Right now in prison, it's hard to see him being so much of a threat, but he did continue to express his views on Twitter, on regular videos, on regular attempts, and also through his team working abroad. And maybe it's just part of Putin's broader desire to clamp down on all forms of dissent ahead of the March 2024 elections to prevent liberal protests and also to prevent ultranationalist unrest, which is why Yurkin and Prigozhin are off the scene too.
Peter, do you want to respond to what you've heard from Vladimir and Samuel before I put a question to you?
Yes, I would like to make a point. I heard those words from Vladimir about democratic institutions in Russia. And before this program started, I also heard those words on 17th of March, Russians will have the opportunity to choose. That is not true. There are no democratic institutions in Russia. There is no judicial system. There is no parliament. Already about 10 years ago, the chairman of the Russian Duma came with those famous words, the State Duma, the parliament, is not a place for discussions. And that's how it's been ever since. It's 100% Putin supporters. Millions of people who are against this policy are unrepresented. They're not allowed to speak up. They're not allowed to run for elections. And when they vote in elections, their votes are stolen and rigged. So I would like to speak directly to your viewers and those who are seeing this. Do not believe it when after the 17th of March you see headlines Russians have elected Putin again. Putin is not Russia. He doesn't represent Russia. Russia is not a democracy in any way. It's a dictatorship, and that's how you should view it.
Okay, I'll be back with you in just a second, Peter, but we've got to give Vladimir a right to reply to that. Russia is in no way a democracy, Vladimir.
Well, I heard right now. I heard what was Peter was saying. Actually, this is his personal point of view. I mean that he has mistaken in many things. I think first of all, it looks from the watches of the show. It looks like we're all living in the slavery. Myself, I'm not. I don't think that I'm living in the slavery. I can take actions of my person. I can criticize. So what do you think, Peter? This is not a democracy. So we are living in a Stalinist era. We are living in a slavery. Again, let's get back to the elections.
All right. I don't want this to dissolve into an argument, but Peter, do you just want to come back on that for a moment?
I'm sorry, as far as I understand, Professor Sotnikov is actually in the pay of the Russian government. He's sitting there getting paid by the Russian government and advocating the Russian government's position, which is his right. And he surely must be given a voice, but I don't think you can take seriously his words that he is able to criticize the Russian government. I haven't heard a single word of criticism from him so far, and I don't know him as Russian government critics. The Russian government critics that I do know are exiled, in jail, or dead, like Alexey Navalny. Those are people, that's what happens to people when they criticize the government in Russia, and that's a dictatorship, just like North Korea, just like Eritrea, just like Belarus, and any other standard dictatorships. And that's how I ask the viewers right now to regard Putin's Russia. It's a country where power is usurped, and the so-called president does not represent his people. They never elected him after the year 2000.
Okay, Vladimir, I'll give you the right to reply to that in just a moment, but we must bring Samuel back in. Samuel, reaction from the West to Navalny's death was swift. The UK's Foreign Office summoned Russian diplomats saying that it holds the Russian authorities fully responsible. There were statements from President Biden, Antony Blinken, the EU Council President, Chancellor Scholz, the Secretary General of NATO. The list goes on. What tools does the West have to constrain or punish Putin further? Can we expect further sanctions on Russia, do you think, or some other form of punitive action now?
So I've been talking to Russians, pro-democracy activists and people around Navalny over the past 24 hours. And one of the biggest things that they told me was that they were very frustrated with the West's lack of response to Navalny's previous mistreatment in prison, his disappearance that occurred shortly before his eventual death. And they really felt that the words that came from Joe Biden, where he was talking about the devastating consequences that would be imposed on Russia, were somewhat hollow. So now it's incumbent on the West to prove those criticisms to be wrong and to take action of some kind. However, I think that the action will most likely be confined to additional sanctions on perpetrators, maybe the expansion of the Magnitsky Act of human rights violators, and that will probably end up just sanctioning people who already are sanctioned and don't have much inclination to move to the West. The other thing that's interesting, though, is will this have a role in expediting or facilitating the House Republicans passing the $60 billion aid package towards Ukraine? Because many of the Republicans who are holding up that package have also in the past been critical of Vladimir Putin's human rights abuses and have stood up for human rights in Russia. So will this finally be the movement that leads to that? If that aid package moves forward, that would be at least some kind of a substantive response to Navalny's death.
Okay. Vladimir, do you think that apart from issuing statements saying that it holds President Putin responsible for the death of Alexey Navalny, how else do you think the West will respond?
I don't think that will be very harsh actions because as we all know, there are 13 package of sanctions is being debated in the European Union. So probably the U.S. President Biden will be imposing some personal sanctions against some political figures in Russia. But that would be all. Another thing, let me just comment on what Peter was saying. Mr. Peter Nikitin was saying. He accused me, as I understood, that I'm being paid by the state, so I'm just voicing what the state thinks. Let me ask one simple question, Peter. Could you say to our viewers, who are you paid by? Are you paid by yourself? Are you paid by the Serbian state? Or are you paid from any kind of Western institutions,
yes, I can answer
which are very much interested? Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
All right.
Okay.
Okay.
All right, Peter. Before I put a question to you, answer that.
Right. So, do you want me to answer now?
Yeah, please do.
Yeah. So I'm a freelance legal translator. I worked for 15 years in international law firms, first in Paris, then in London. Right now, I'm making my bread as a freelance legal translator from several languages into several languages. I live in a 2-room apartment in Belgrade. I am not in any way connected to any government. And insofar as the activities we're organizing here in Belgrade are concerned, those are financed by donations, given mostly in cash, by the Russian exile community here, which is very large. That is by whom I am paid. I am not. I don't hold a position at the state university like my interlocutor.
Okay, let's get back to Alexey Navalny. Peter, Garry Kasparov, writing on X, said that, quote, Putin is Navalny's killer, make no mistake, but there's blame enough to share, first for the Russians who failed to match Alexei's courage to end Putin's dictatorship and war. My rage and eternal scorn, though, to the Western politicians who treated Navalny's poisoning and jailing as just another negotiating point with Putin. Big talk, no action, he said. More blood on their hands. How valid is that criticism?
Well, I'm sorry, it was a very long quote, and I'm not quite sure what Mr. Kasparov was trying to say. Mr. Kasparov, as far as he's concerned, I wish he supported Navalny while he was alive rather than after he died. As far as I understood, the topic is what's the West going to do now? Is that right?
Yeah.
My view is I don't know what the West is going to do, but I know what the West should do, and actually should have done long ago. The West should first stop recognizing Vladimir Putin as a legitimate representative of the Russian people, stop any kind of contacts with him apart from those that are essential for security purposes. Second, the West should finally implement the sanctions that it's already introduced, because we know that Putin is still producing rockets, including with elements imported from the West, from Western countries, and even from the United States. Third, the West should finally give Ukraine what Ukraine needs in order to defend itself and in order to end this war. This is what the West should do, and I hope that Navalny's death will prompt the West to action, to more serious action than has been showing right now. Unfortunately, I don't have very much hope for that.
Samuel, Navalny believed that exile would lead to political irrelevance. He was determined to stay in Russia. As you heard in Laura's report at the beginning of the program, he was jailed after returning from Germany after being poisoned. He was behind bars when Russia invaded Ukraine. Would he have been, do you think, a more effective opposition voice had he remained outside Russia?
Well, it's really hard to say whether he would have been or not. I would say that obviously there is some possibility that he would have still been a public figure, an influential voice, but his views may have had a lot more difficulty reaching ordinary Russians because of some of the restrictions on social media and some of the restrictions on media censorship. He still could have gotten his voice out, but it may have been a bit harder. And I think that, there needs to be more coordination between the Russian diaspora communities that have formed, particularly amongst liberals in countries like Armenia, Georgia, Serbia, and also elsewhere in Europe, for there to be more of a chance of concrete action. So I think that Navalny's obviously his life probably would have been saved by staying abroad, but his impact and his legacy may have been quite different.
Vladimir, the Kremlin always claimed that Navalny was just a minor political figure, but President Putin was clearly bothered by him, wasn't he? Refusing even to say his name when asked about him. Why was that?
I think for Vladimir Putin, for President Vladimir Putin, he was really a minor political leader. You know, I mean that when Russian president met with the General Secretary of the United Nations, with the presidents of the United States and other countries, what do you think? By the way, how can he regard Navalny, although myself, I personally think that he was a great political professional, you see? So what President Putin could think about Navalny, you know, and let me disagree again with my colleagues that the total prosecution of the persons killing of the opponents, you know, the picture that they are showing in what they are saying for the viewers is very much green. So it makes an impression that probably Russia is a bad country under Putin. Putin is a bad guy, and all the West has to do is just to remove him from power. But it's not like that. Believe me, it's not like that. The people. Not obediently, not by force, will be voting for him, and you will see the results.
All right. One last question to Peter. What will Alexey Navalny's legacy be, given the way in which Russia has gone under President Putin? Did he die in vain?
Alexey Navalny's legacy will be Russia's conscience. He did a lot to clear Russia's name before the world, the name of the Russian people. He showed that not all Russian people, like Vladimir said, obediently go and vote for Putin. There are Russian people who resist, who are not afraid. And he was the greatest example of that. The future depends on us, and it depends on you, the viewers, whether you will support us and Ukraine, or whether you're going to simply ignore us.
Okay, there, gentlemen, we must end it. Vladimir Sotnikov, Samuel Ramani, and Peter Nikitin, many thanks indeed for being with us on the programme. As always, thank you for watching. You can see the programme again at any time by going to the website. It's at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, join us at our Facebook page at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And of course, you can join the conversation on X. Our handle there, at AJ Inside Story, from me, Adrian Finnegan, and the team here. Thanks for watching. See you again.